Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. It all started when I moved into the old house I inherited from my grandmother. The place had been in our family for generations. A large, creaky Victorian home at the edge of a small, quiet town. I was excited to have my own space, but the house itself was daunting. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets of the past, and the floors groaned under the weight of memories long forgotten. The isolation was both comforting and unnerving, especially at night when the silence became almost oppressive. I was a young woman in my early 20s, eager to start a new chapter of my life. The house was old, yes, but it was mine. I spent the first few weeks exploring every nook and cranny, trying to get comfortable in my new home. But despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. It was as if the house was watching me, waiting. It started with the attic. Every night without fail, I'd hear noises coming from above, soft, muffled thumps that grew louder as the hours passed. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling, but as the nights went on, the noises became impossible to ignore. It was as if something, or someone, was moving around up there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal that had somehow gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The sound was too deliberate, too human-like. Every time I heard it, a chill would crawl up my spine, and I'd find myself frozen in place, straining to hear what came next. But nothing ever did. Just those unsettling thumps that would stop as suddenly as they began. Then things started to go missing. At first it was small, insignificant items. A book here, a hairbrush there. I thought I was just being forgetful, misplacing things in the chaos of unpacking. But then, the incidents became more frequent, more disturbing. One morning I woke up to find my kitchen in disarray. Cupboards were left open, dishes scattered across the counter, and the back door, which I was certain I'd locked, was slightly ajar. Panic set in as I realized this wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been in my house while I was asleep. The final straw was when I noticed my food supply dwindling. Bread that should have lasted a week was gone in days, and groceries seemed to disappear as soon as I brought them home. I started to find dirty dishes in the sink that I hadn't used and clothes in my laundry that I hadn't worn. It became clear that I wasn't alone in the house. Someone else was living there with me. Someone who was trying very hard not to be seen. The unease I felt grew with each passing day, but nothing could have prepared me for the night I finally came face to face with the intruder. It was late, well past midnight, when I was jolted awake by a loud crash from downstairs. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to hear any other sounds. The house was eerily quiet, but I knew something was wrong. The crash had been real, not just a product of my overactive imagination. Grabbing the nearest object, a heavy flashlight, I crept out of bed and made my way downstairs. Each step felt like it echoed through the entire house, my nerves on edge with every creak of the floorboards. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, the shadow of a person moving in the kitchen. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. I stood frozen for a moment, fear rooting me to the spot. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the figure. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a disheveled man standing in my kitchen, his eyes wild and frantic. He was as startled as I was, and for a brief second, we just stared at each other in shock. Then he lunged at me. I screamed and stumbled backward, barely avoiding his grasp. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, plunging the room back into darkness. I could hear him breathing heavily, his footsteps closing in on me. Desperation fueled my movements as I fumbled for the door, my fingers finally finding the handle. I threw it open and ran outside, screaming for help as I sprinted to a neighbor's house. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I watched from my neighbor's porch as they stormed the house, my heart still racing from the encounter. After what felt like hours, they emerged with the man in handcuffs. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion, as they led him to the squad car. The officers assured me that I was safe now, but their words did little to calm the storm of fear still raging inside me. The intruder was taken away, and I was left to piece together the remnants of my shattered sense of security. My home, once a sanctuary, now felt tainted, invaded. In the days that followed, the full horror of the situation came to light. As the police investigated, they discovered signs that the man had been living in my house for weeks, possibly even longer. He had been staying in the attic, sneaking down at night to take food and other necessities while I slept just a few rooms away. The attic was filled with remnants of his presence, makeshift bedding, empty food containers, and even some of my belongings that I hadn't realized were missing. The thought of him lurking just above me, watching, waiting, sent shivers down my spine. The scariest part? He had been there the entire time, slipping in and out of the shadows, undetected. I had been living with a stranger and I never even knew it. Story 2, the phantom phone calls. I was 16 when my parents decided to go out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone for the first time. I was excited about the prospect of having the house to myself. No curfew, no chores, just a weekend of freedom. I lived in a typical suburban neighborhood where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. My parents left early Friday morning, reminding me to be responsible and not to throw any wild parties. I promised them I'd be good and waved them off, already planning my weekend of binge-watching horror movies and eating junk food. By nightfall, I was settled on the couch, popcorn in hand, enjoying the peace and quiet of having the house to myself. It was around 10 p.m. when the phone rang for the first time. I paused the movie, slightly annoyed in the interruption. Expecting it to be one of my parents checking in, I answered without thinking twice. But when I put the receiver to my ear, there was nothing, just silence. "Hello," I said, but no one responded. I waited for a few seconds, thinking it might be a bad connection, but the silence on the other end was almost deliberate. It felt as if someone was there, listening, but refusing to speak. After a long pause, the line went dead. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just a wrong number, and went back to my movie. But an hour later, the phone rang again. This time, and when I picked up, there was the same eerie silence. No words, no noise, just a heavy, unsettling quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I hung up, my earlier excitement fading into a vague sense of unease. The calls continued throughout the night, each one more unnerving than the last. At first, it was just the silence, but then I started to hear faint noises in the background, breathing maybe, or the rustling of fabric. The kind of sounds that make your skin crawl because you know someone is on the other end, but they're not saying a word. By midnight, I was officially freaked out. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race, and I'd hesitate before answering, hoping it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. The calls were real, and they were getting worse. The noises became more distinct, like distant whispers or the creaking of floorboards, as if the caller was moving around in a space much like mine. I started to feel paranoid, jumping at every little sound the house made. The once comforting silence of being home alone now felt oppressive, every creak and groan of the house amplified by my growing fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever was on the other end of those calls wasn't far away at all. By 2 a.m., the phone calls had become relentless. I was too scared to keep answering, so I let the phone ring and ring, but it wouldn't stop. I sat there on the couch, my eyes fixed on the phone as it rang out in the dark, the sound echoing through the empty house. The ringing felt like it was drilling into my skull, a constant reminder that someone was out there, or so I thought. In a moment of desperate curiosity, I decided to answer one last time. As I picked up the phone, a wave of nausea hit me. My hand trembled as I brought the receiver to my ear. But this time, there was no silence, no strange noises. Instead, I heard a soft click, followed by the unmistakable sound of a second phone hanging up. My heart dropped. I slowly lowered the phone, my mind racing. We only had one landline phone in the house, or so I believed. But the click I heard was coming from another extension. Someone else was in the house with me, using a different phone to make these calls. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The calls weren't coming from outside, they were coming from inside the house. Panic surged through me as I dropped the receiver and looked around the dark, empty rooms. My breathing quickened, and every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified by my fear. I bolted from the couch, grabbing my keys and phone, and ran to the front door. My hands shook so badly I fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity before finally getting the door open. I didn't look back as I sprinted outside, my only thought being to get as far away from the house as possible. I ran to my neighbor's house, banging on the door and praying they wake up. When they finally did, I could barely get the words out, but they quickly understood something was terribly wrong. They called the police, and I waited outside with them, too scared to go back into my house. The police arrived within minutes and swept through the house, searching every room, every closet. I watched from the safety of the neighbor's front porch, my heart still pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours, the police finally emerged from the house, their faces grim. They had found someone, a man hiding in the basement, crouched in the dark with the house's second phone in his hand. He had been there the entire time, making those calls, listening to me move around the house, getting closer with each passing hour. They let him out in handcuffs, his face obscured by the shadows. I didn't recognize him, but the fact that he had been in my home for God knows how long made my skin crawl. The police told me later that he had likely broken in days ago, waiting for the right moment to terrorize me. I had been living above him, completely unaware, while he hid just below my feet. Even now, the thought of those phone calls sends chills down my spine. Knowing he was there the whole time, listening to me, waiting, is something I'll never forget. Story 3. The Unseen Watcher. I had always dreamed of living in a quiet, remote area, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. So when I finally found a small cottage nestled in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor, it felt like a dream come true. The solitude was exactly what I needed, a place where I could unwind, enjoy nature, and escape the chaos of the world. The cottage was perfect. Surrounded by dense trees, it felt like my own little haven, cut off from everything and everyone. The nearest town was a good half-hour drive, and I rarely saw anyone pass by on the narrow dirt road that led to my home. It was just me, the trees, and the endless stretch of sky above. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation that once felt so comforting began to feel different. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. I'd come home from a walk in the woods to find the front door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it. At first I thought maybe the wind had pushed it open, or I had simply forgotten to latch it properly. But then it happened again, and again. I became more cautious, double-checking the locks every time I left the house. But no matter how careful I was, I'd return to find the door open, or a window cracked just enough to let in a draft. The first time it happened, I laughed it off, but the more it occurred, the less amusing it became. Then there were the noises, faint creaks and groans in the night that I couldn't quite place. I'd wake up to the sound of something moving outside, like twigs snapping underfoot. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just animals, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. The turning point came one morning when I stepped outside to find fresh footprints in the dirt surrounding the house. They weren't mine. These were larger, heavier, made by someone wearing boots. My blood ran cold as I followed the trail, which circled the cottage and led right up to my bedroom window. Whoever it was had been standing there just inches away from where I slept, watching me through the glass. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed in the vast emptiness of the woods. There was no one to call out to, no neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. I was completely alone. The footprints didn't stop at my window. They continued around the house, leading to the back door, which I found slightly ajar, just as I had so many times before. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open wider, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows. But the house was empty, at least it appeared to be. For the first time since moving in, I felt truly vulnerable. Someone had been watching me, lurking around my home, and I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. The isolation that once felt like a blessing had become a curse, and I realized just how easy it would be for someone to get close to me without ever being seen. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound, every creak of the old cottage seemed amplified, feeding into my growing paranoia. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was out there. Something or someone watching me. It was around 3 a.m. when I finally gave in to the anxiety and got out of bed. I moved quietly through the house, checking the locks on every door and window, trying to reassure myself that I was safe. But as I approached the kitchen, something made me stop dead in my tracks. Through the small window above the sink, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing just outside, barely visible in the dim moonlight. My breath caught my throat, and for a moment I was frozen with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring into the house. It felt like hours passed as I stood there, locked in a silent standoff with the figure outside. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel the intensity of their gaze, as if they were studying me, waiting for me to react. My heart pounded in my chest and every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink, afraid that if I did, they would come closer. Finally, the figure began to move, slowly fading back into the darkness of the woods. As soon as it was out of sight, I snapped out of my trance and backed away from the window, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper as I told the operator what had happened. The police arrived quickly, considering the remote location. They searched the area around the house but found no sign of the intruder, just the same footprints I had seen earlier, now mixed with fresh ones that led into the woods. They assured me they would patrol the area for the rest of the night, but their words did little to calm my nerves. I spent the next day fortifying the cottage. I installed new locks on every door and window, added motion-activated lights around the perimeter, and even put up a few security cameras. The sense of peace I had once felt in my secluded home was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of fear. I no longer felt safe, even with the new precautions in place. The following morning, I stepped outside to inspect the security cameras, hoping they had captured some evidence of the intruder. As I made my way around the house, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. New footprints in the dirt, fresh from the night before. They were different from the ones I had seen before, closer, more deliberate. They circled the entire house, lingering near every door and window, including the one where I had seen the figure. The watcher had returned, undeterred by the police or the new security measures. They were still out there, watching, waiting. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. No matter what I did, no matter how many precautions I took, I was never truly alone. The watcher was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and they weren't going away. Story 4. The Cursed Doll. When my great-aunt passed away, she left behind a house full of antiques, each with its own story. Most of the items were auctioned off, but a few things were kept in the family. One of those items was an old porcelain doll she had owned since childhood. No one else wanted it. Its pale face and glassy eyes were unsettling, to say the least. But for some reason, I felt drawn to it. I figured it was just a relic from her past, a keepsake that might have meant something to her. So I took it home, not thinking much of it. The doll was small, maybe a foot tall, with curly dark hair and a faded pink dress that had once been elegant but was now yellowed with age. Its eyes, large and eerily lifelike, seemed to follow me wherever I went. I set it on a shelf in my living room, intending to let it gather dust with the rest of my inherited knickknacks. But from the moment the doll entered my home, things started to change. At first, the changes were subtle, so subtle that I almost didn't notice them. I'd come home from work to find the doll in a slightly different position than I left it. Sometimes it would be facing a different direction, or its hands would be in a new position. I tried to brush it off, thinking I must have moved it without realizing. But the unease was there, lurking in the back of my mind. Then one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the doll wasn't on the shelf where I'd left it. My heart skipped a beat as I searched the room, finally finding it on the other side of the room, perched on the arm of a chair. There was no one else in the house, no one who could have moved it. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I convinced myself it must have been a trick of my memory. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Things escalated quickly after that night. The doll started appearing in different rooms entirely, once on the kitchen counter, another time at the foot of my bed. Each time it was closer to me than before. I'd lock it in a cabinet, only to find it sitting on the living room couch the next day, its glassy eyes fixed on me as if it was watching, waiting. Then came the whispering. Late at night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I'd hear faint, unintelligible murmurs. The sound was soft at first, like someone was speaking in another room. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. I'd sit up in bed straining to make out the words, but they were always just out of reach, just on the edge of comprehension. One night, the whispers were accompanied by a loud crash from the living room. I rushed out of bed to find that the doll had been thrown across the room, lying face down on the floor. The shelf it had been sitting on was untouched, and nothing else was disturbed. It was as if the doll had hurled itself off the shelf in a fit of rage. I stood there staring at it, my pulse racing as the realization sank in. This wasn't just an old, creepy toy. There was something else at work here, something I couldn't explain. The occurrences became more frequent, more violent. Objects around the house would be thrown with such force that they shattered against the walls. Lights would flicker on and off by themselves, and the air in the room would suddenly turn icy cold, even in the middle of summer. And through it all, the doll would be there, its expression unchanged, its eyes always on me. By this point, I knew I had brought something into my home that I couldn't control, something malevolent. The doll was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a conduit for something dark, something that wanted to make its presence known. The night everything came to a head was the most terrifying of all. I had finally had enough of the doll's increasingly disturbing behavior and decided to lock it away for good. I found an old, sturdy trunk in the attic and placed the doll inside, wrapping it tightly in a blanket. I slammed the lid shut and locked it with a heavy padlock, determined to keep it contained. I even placed the trunk in the basement, far away from where I slept, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever evil resided within the doll at bay. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of relief as I went to bed, convincing myself that I had finally taken control of the situation. The house was silent, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I drifted off to sleep, without the constant dread that had plagued me. But my relief was short-lived. In the dead of night, I awoke suddenly. My room plunged into an unnatural cold. My breath fogged the air as I shivered beneath the covers, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. And that's when I saw it. Sitting in the corner of my room, on the chair by the window, was the doll. I stared in disbelief, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. I had locked it away, sealed it in a trunk, and hidden it in the basement. Yet here it was, back in my room as if it had never left. Its glassy eyes gleamed in the dim light, fixed on me with a malevolence that chilled me to the bone. I scrambled out of bed, panic surging through me. I couldn't take it anymore. The doll had to go, and it had to go now. Without thinking, I grabbed the doll and ran out of the house, not even bothering to put on shoes. The night air was bitterly cold, but I barely noticed as I raced to the backyard. I didn't care where the doll ended up. I just needed it gone, out of my life for good. I found an old metal trash can, the kind used for burning leaves, and threw the doll inside. My hands trembled as I doused it in lighter fluid, the smell sharp and acrid in the still night air. With a flick of a match, I set the doll alight, watching as the flames roared to life, consuming the fabric of its dress, charring its porcelain face. I stood there, watching until there was nothing left but ashes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a sense of finality, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was over. I went back inside, exhausted but hopeful that I had finally rid myself of the cursed doll and whatever malevolent force it had brought with it. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The house seemed brighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But as I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting on the kitchen table, was the doll. It was untouched by the flames, its dress pristine, its eyes even more lifelike and cold. But something was different now. Its expression, which had always been blank and emotionless, had changed. A sinister smile curled at the corners of its lips, and its eyes seemed to glint with malice. It was as if it knew what I had tried to do, and it was mocking me for thinking I could ever be rid of it. I stumbled back, A scream caught in my throat. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a doll. It was something much worse, something that wouldn't be so easily destroyed. The haunting wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story 5. The Haunted Baby Monitor. Becoming a parent for the first time is both exhilarating and terrifying. The sheer responsibility of caring for a tiny, helpless human being can be overwhelming, but it also fills you with a fierce protectiveness. I had just brought my newborn daughter home from the hospital a few weeks ago, and every day was a whirlwind of feeding, changing, and trying to get as much sleep as possible in between. My husband had to go on a short business trip, leaving me alone with the baby for the first time. It was just for a couple of nights, and I reassured myself that I could handle it. After all, it was just me and my daughter in our cozy little house, a place that had always felt warm and safe. To keep an eye on her, I used a baby monitor that allowed me to hear every little noise she made, from her soft breathing to the occasional whimper in her sleep. It was a comfort, knowing I could always hear her, even if I was in another room. But that comfort quickly turned into a source of dread. It started on the first night my husband was away. I had just put the baby down in her crib and settled into bed, the baby monitor placed on the nightstand beside me. The soft static hum of the monitor was a familiar sound, one that usually helped me relax, knowing my daughter was safe. But as I lay there, trying to drift off to sleep, I heard something that made my eyes snap open. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, coming through the monitor. At first I thought it was just a trick of my tired mind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. Someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat up, staring at the monitor, my heart pounding. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. There was someone else in my daughter's room. I grabbed the monitor and held it closer, straining to hear, but the voice stopped as suddenly as it had started. All I could hear now was the soft sound of my baby's breathing. I wanted to believe it was just interference, maybe picking up a neighbor's signal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The voice had been too close, too distinct, and it was in my baby's room. The next night, the voices returned, but this time, they were more persistent, more disturbing. As soon as I put my daughter down and turned on the monitor, I heard them. Soft whispers like a conversation happening just out of earshot. My blood ran cold as I listened, trying to make out the words. It was as if multiple people were talking, their voices overlapping in a dissonant murmur. Then amidst the whispers, I caught a few words that made my skin crawl. The baby, she's ours. Take her. The voices were talking about my daughter, saying things no parent ever wants to hear. I felt a wave of nausea as the sinister whispers continued, growing more insistent, more threatening. Panic surged through me. I rushed to my daughter's room, bursting through the door, expecting to find someone or something standing over her crib. But the room was empty, just as I had left it. My daughter was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the horror playing out over the monitor. I checked every corner of the room, every shadowed nook, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. But when I returned to my bedroom, the voices had grown louder on the monitor, more malicious. They were saying things I couldn't even comprehend, their tone filled with an unnatural hatred. The house, once a safe haven, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in on me, the whispers echoing in my ears even after I turned off the monitor. I was alone, with no one to turn to, and the voices were only getting worse. The voices had reached a fever pitch by the third night. I was beyond exhausted, running on nothing but fear and adrenaline. Every time I tried to sleep, the whispers would pull me back into a state of raw terror. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. But what happened next made me realize that my worst fears were real. I had just put my daughter down to sleep, her tiny form swaddled in blankets, and I lingered in her room for a moment longer than usual, my nerves on edge. The room was silent, peaceful, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I kissed her forehead and left the room, clutching the baby monitor as if it were a lifeline. Back in my bedroom, I hesitated before turning on the monitor, dreading what I might hear. But when the screen lit up, it wasn't the voices that chilled me to the core. It was what I saw. Its eyes, empty, hollow voids, seemed to lock onto mine through the screen. I gasped, dropping the monitor in shock. My mind raced, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. This wasn't just a trick of the light or a malfunction of the monitor. There was something in the room with my baby. Without thinking, I ran to her room, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I flung open the door, expecting the worst, but when I entered, the room was empty. The figure was gone. My daughter lay peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. But the room felt different, colder, darker, as if the air itself had been tainted. I didn't hesitate for a second longer. I scooped my daughter up, holding her close as I ran from the room, down the stairs and out of the house. I didn't even stop to grab anything else. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between us and that house as possible. Once we were outside, I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed my husband. I was barely coherent, my words spilling out in a frantic rush. But he understood the urgency in my voice. He told me to get somewhere safe and that he'd be on the first flight home. I ended up at a friend's house, too scared to go anywhere near my own. As soon as I felt safe enough, I called the police. But there was little they could do. They searched the house but found no signs of an intruder, no evidence of the figure I had seen. They chalked it up to stress and exhaustion, but I knew better. There was something evil in that house, something that had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. A few days later, after we had settled into a hotel, my husband and I started looking into the history of the house, desperate for answers. What we found left us both speechless and horrified. The previous occupants had left the house abruptly, selling it at a suspiciously low price and moving out of state with no explanation. When we finally tracked them down, their story mirrored mine in chilling detail. They had also experienced strange voices over the baby monitor, objects moving on their own, and glimpses of ghostly figures in their child's room. They had fled in the middle of the night, just as I had, too terrified to stay another moment. The haunting had driven them away, and they had tried to forget about the house, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the evil that lurked within those walls was still there, waiting for the next family to move in, to continue its sinister game. The realization that we had unknowingly walked into the same nightmare that had plagued them was almost too much to bear. We never went back to that house. Whatever was in there could have it. We weren't going to be its next victims.